Hello and welcome back to the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman. A new report submitted to the United Nations by an international team of physicians and human rights advocates documents what its authors describe as a two-pronged attack on healthcare workers in Gaza and around the world to silence critique of Israel's genocide. The report, Healthcare Workers as Human Rights Defenders, a medical perspective on Israel's genocide enablement apparatus in Gaza and abroad, highlights the urgent need for a medical definition of genocide as defined by Doctors Against Genocide to enable timely interventions by healthcare workers. Meanwhile, in January, the aid agency Save the Children issued a report on Israel's explosive weapons in Gaza. The group estimates that in 2024, an average of 475 children each month, or 15 children a day, were left with potentially lifelong disabilities, including amputated or severely injured limbs and hearing impairments because of the explosive weapons. These injuries, Save the Children adds, have been worsened due to the decimation of the health system and destruction of health facilities in Gaza, as well as the restricted flow and low availability of medicines, which has made treatment, therapeutic, or rehabilitative care inside Gaza near impossible. Children who have lost legs require long-term specialist care as they grow, with regular reviews of appropriate prosthetics and other treatments, sometimes as much as every 6 months. These treatments, Save the Children says, are currently impossible to receive in Gaza. Joining us again to talk about the medical catastrophe in Gaza and much more is Dr. Mimi Syed. Mimi is an emergency physician who worked in Gaza twice last year. We had her on here on the Electronic Intifada podcast in late December when she was still working in Gaza. She was part of a group of medical professionals who recently met with U.S. lawmakers in Washington, D.C. to talk about what they witnessed. Mimi, thank you so much for coming back to the Electronic Intifada podcast.
Hi, thanks for having me, Nora.
Well, it's good to see you again. I want to talk about your visit to Washington in a few minutes, but first, can you talk about the ceasefire and what terms, healthcare-wise, Israel has agreed to that it is not upholding? We're recording this on February 20th, and Israel still has not allowed in essential medical equipment, medicine, let alone the heavy machinery needed to remove the rubble and rebuild the hospitals that Israel has decimated over the last 16 months. What is important to know about the ceasefire terms and Israel's obligations that it is continuing to fail to meet, specifically around the medical sector?
Yeah, I mean, I think the term ceasefire is kind of loose. It's a loosely used term. It's the situation in the healthcare sector has not changed really. I have colleagues that I still speak to that are still working in the hospitals, and just a few days ago spoke to Dr. Al-Farah, who is a pediatric intensivist at Nasser, and he was telling me that life-saving medications are being blocked still. And there's just really no reason for it. There's children that are going to actually die if they don't receive these medications, and this continues. And you mentioned, the heavy machinery needed to clear the rubble. I mean, you can't do anything if there aren't roads that are clear to drive on to get to the hospitals, to get to the places where aid is needed. This was promised under the agreement. Shelter and temporary houses were promised to be allowed to enter, and those also are being held up at the border. The amount of aid and the things that are needed to repair, it's not even it's a very small fraction of what's actually being allowed in. And so, even if you do have a ceasefire, you can't really do much with everything that's been destroyed. There's people that have gone back to the north that are going back to powder, that are going back to rubble. There's no houses there. In the north, the healthcare system is even worse off than the south. There are no standing, functioning hospitals anymore. The all of the machinery, all of the machines that were the medical equipment are deliberately like broken at Kamal Adwan Hospital, an Indonesian hospital. So it's not even a fraction of what's actually was promised. But you can't really have a hospital if you don't have clean water, if you don't have electricity grid. All of those things are necessary to actually have a functioning brick and mortar hospital.
You treated so many children and young people while you were in Gaza as an emergency doctor. You testified in Washington, D.C. about a little girl who an Israeli sniper had shot, and you had CT scans of her head. If you could talk about her and also tell us the story of Mido Halimi, a teenager who had a large social media following and was brought into your emergency room after being severely injured in an Israeli airstrike. We actually have some CT scans of his head. Tell us about these two children as examples of those that you treated.
Yeah, Mira's a 4-year-old little girl, and I talk about her a lot in media. I also presented her CT scan when we went to speak to the Congress staff as well as in the UN in New York City. But she's a 4-year-old little girl that was eating breakfast on August 24th in her tent, and she was shot in the head by a drone sniper, as her parents reported. She was brought in, barely hanging on to life, of course, but I was able to, do the initial saving her life. By protecting her airway. And again, with a piece of medical equipment that was not allowed in by the Israeli military, I had to smuggle that laryngoscope that I used inside to save her life. But she was fortunately able to receive the surgeries and the care afterwards that she needed. But of course, with someone who has an injury like that, is going to require further medical care, probably for the rest of her life, in order to have any sort of normal life. And yeah, if you were to meet Mira, she looks like a normal little 4-year-old. She talks and smiles and laughs and jokes around and, says, I love you, Doctora Mimi. All of these things. And I was able to, reunite with her when I was back in December. But she's been waiting for a medical evacuation. And since that, time that we've been working at it, her mother has actually been injured because of another airstrike just recently after I returned in January, and she's now has a traumatic amputation to her limb. And she's the primary caregiver of this child. So not only does Mira need medical evacuation, but her companion, who would have been her mother, is no longer a candidate to be her companion because she herself needs medical care outside of Gaza. And we know that adults aren't really allowed out for medical care. Children are barely allowed out. So, it just creates this terrible issue. And then, you add on top of it, they're not allowed to travel with their other children. And so, how do I ask a mother to separate from her small children? It's just I can't even imagine the how that feels. And the people that are leaving are not allowed any kind of certainty if they will be able to return. So knowing that your child is still there in these dire conditions, I can't ask a mother to leave her children. So it just puts everybody in these unexpected, these just terrible conditions, sometimes worse. I mean, if you asked me to leave my child, that would be a new level of hell for me, So
Yeah.
those are those are the dire conditions that people are facing there, these decisions.
And tell us about Mido. I actually have some CAT scans that you sent me. We can look at those. Tell us about this is a, a series of slides from the CT that you got from him. Tell us his about him and his story and what happened and what these CAT scans reveal.
Yeah, Mira Halimi was a very prominent TikTok influencer, actually. I think he was in his late teens, and he was just this like ray of sunshine in the middle of all of this, chaos and destruction. Very positive, and would just kind of show his life in the tents in the Mawasi area. I understood later. I learned that he actually was an exchange student in the U.S. At one point, and so he spoke really good English. And so, people, the things he was saying would resonate with people here in this country as well as other places, just globally. And he had a huge following. But he had this routine. He would go to an internet cafe and, basically show his daily life. And The day before he died on August 25th, he got a haircut, and was basically showing he went to the internet cafe and he was trying to get some work done and things like that. But on August 26th, he came in as part of a mass casualty incident where I was when I was working. Incidentally, it was my birthday. It was one of the worst mass casualty incidents that I had there when I was there. We had hundreds of casualties that day, multiple times a day. But he was a part of afterwards an airstrike, an air raid in that Mawasi area, which was, again, to note, a humanitarian safe zone. But we received dozens of patients that day, and it's common practice, and I think all of my colleagues have witnessed. And Dr. Nizam Mahmoud actually testified in front of the parliament about this very thing that we witnessed, which was after an air raid, drone snipers or quadcopters, they call them, would go and actually shoot off and finish off the remaining people there. And they would be shot in the head, shot in the chest, so that you're basically leveling off all of the survivors. And Mito, unfortunately, was one of those people. He was brought in, and it was reported in the news as a shrapnel injury, but he had two wounds in his head, and one was on the one side, and the other was on the exiting side. And this was a bullet, most likely. And you can see from the CT scan, it actually shows the path of this. And I actually tried to save his life. I was able to intubate him, number one, but I was able to take him to the CT scanner, as you can see, and that's the way I was able to provide these images. But he had, two wounds on his head, which would most likely be an entry and exit wound. I examined his whole body. I did a fast scan on him, which is an ultrasound that reveals any kind of internal injuries in the abdomen or the thorax. Nothing was there. He was actually clean. I in fact have a video, and I was explaining in the video what happened to him. And he was shot by a drone sniper. And I believe that he was deliberately targeted, as many, many people are, when you see them shot in the head repeatedly. Um, so it's unfortunate that it was reported as a shrapnel. It doesn't bring him back, but I feel like, the truth still needs to be told about how he was killed. That day, we had multiple casualties from this very, internet cafe that people were shot at, and most of them came in with bullets in the head. And so it's just it's
Yeah.
another example of just deliberately shooting. And he's not the first prominent figure, an influencer that's been targeted. Many
Yeah.
people there have been deliberately targeted and killed.
Can you explain to us what we're seeing here on these CT scans for people who aren't familiar with imaging like this?
Yeah, typically with shrapnel, you would see some kind of shrapnel like leave behind, small fragments of metal or something like that. And these are actually not that you're just seeing a path of a metal object going through, which usually looks like a bullet. I've showed this to, other trauma surgeons that have extensive experience with dealing with neurotrauma, just like this penetrating trauma. And they said, of course, unless you witnessed it happening, you can't say that this was a bullet 100%, but this looks very suspicious for a bullet path. And, I examined him. I spoke to people who brought him in, spoke to witnesses who saw what happened, and they told me that this was a quadcopter. And that was routine practice for me, is to ask people who brought him in what happened. And that's why I have a recording, a video. And at the time, I didn't know who this was. I actually didn't know who Mito Halimi was until I returned. And my husband used to follow him and told me when I returned, hey, did you know Mito Halimi was killed when you were there? And I said, oh, I didn't know that. But when I went back and I was processing all the images and the videos that I had, he looked so familiar to me, and I looked into it further, and I realized that this is Mito Halimi. And the video that I submitted to you, I'm saying in there too, this is a late teen shot by a quadcopter, shot in the head. But this is essentially, these red lines are showing the path of the entry from the entry, or presumed exit entry. It's hard to tell, but there's two wounds there, and it goes diagonally across the brain there. And it's a clear pathway.
Yeah. Yeah, so it goes from the right side of the head to the left. Is that right?
Mhm. Yeah, presumably, yes.
Unbelievable. And when he showed up in the emergency department, I mean, what were you able to do with the limited amount of equipment and medication and and abilities?
Yeah, I mean, it was just like when Mira arrived, a couple days before that. I tried to protect his airway, number one, because that's the first thing, in trauma or anything really is to protect the airway, to save his life. And a lot of times people with neurotrauma like this, when they're coming in as a mass casualty incident, they're basically left to die because there's very little resources to take care of them. And so it's considered a wasted effort to try to salvage someone with neurotrauma like that. But I don't know. I intubated a lot of people, and I was almost like, people there were like, "Why are you intubating everyone?" And it was one of those things for me. I just had to do it just to give people a chance. And Mito, unfortunately, he wasn't as fortunate as Mira. And I wasn't able to save his life, and he ended up succumbing to the injury
Mm.
shortly after that. So.
Um, when you came back, you recently went to Washington, D.C., as I mentioned. Tell us about what your intent was in meeting with U.S. lawmakers and if you were able to meet with any of them personally, um, and and what kinds of testimonies you gave there at the Capitol, and what the intent was in bringing these stories, especially the story of Mira, to U.S. lawmakers.
Yeah, I mean, we had a multi-approach kind of, strategy, I guess you want to call it, but we really just wanted to show as American physicians, this is what we witnessed. And it's important because we are funding this. And, I wasn't able to myself personally meet with any senior members. But I understand that a couple of other, we were in a group and they maybe met with someone that was somewhat in a senior position. But I met with basically interns, and we had a press briefing as well where we showed these CT scans. I showed a CT scan of Mira with the bullet in her head, among other things that we shared with them. And unfortunately, it wasn't a big turnout. But when we did meet with various states and their interns, our message was that this needs to stop. These are children. It was 50% population of children. This is a war on children essentially, and we have to stop funding this. And I'm pretty naive. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to show them a CT scan of a child with a bullet in her head. They're going to say, oh my God, this needs to stop. Unfortunately, that's not the case. I think that they know this is happening, and I do think that they agree. Most people agree that shooting children in the head is wrong. But there's this elephant in the room that you can't say anything else after that. And unfortunately, it just felt like, yeah, they were there to listen, and they did, for their, and more some states were more kind of receptive than others, and sympathetic. But we also spoke about reestablishing UNRWA, also reestablishing more medical corridors to be allowed children evacuation, which is a really big thing that we're lacking. When we went to DC afterwards, four of us went to United Nations in New York City to speak with them, and we were fortunately there, obviously able to meet with Secretary General, which we were very fortunate and very grateful for. But we spoke about having more medical corridors available for patients to evacuate to, and specifically East Jerusalem and West Bank. Not only is it closer to Gaza, but it's also more cost effective. And the hospitals there are willing to take the patients. The block is from the Kogat side. They're not allowed that transportation, or that path to get there. And so that's what we're advocating for. But also we just explain to them the dire conditions, like the life expectancy after October 7th has dropped to 30 years. By 30 years, that's like almost half
It's
of a person's.
unbelievable.
That's unheard of. Miscarriage chances after October 7th, 300%. If that's not a direct insult on the birth rate, and the growth of a population, I don't know what else is. I don't know how else to frame it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and along with that, as I mentioned, you submitted a report to the UN detailing the attacks on healthcare itself in Gaza, as well as international healthcare workers like yourself who speak out about Israel's crimes and are being, repressed, attacked, targeted, or fired from their positions in U.S. Hospitals and clinics. This is all in the context of trying to get an international, definition of genocide applied to the catastrophic situation for Gaza's healthcare system. And of course, that goes along with the obligations under the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, who have assessed that Israel is most likely committing genocide. There are arrest warrants out for those in power in Israel who have carried out this genocide that are not being enacted on. Talk about this UN report and what kind of response it has received so far.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this was more of a, focus on healthcare and how we're being doxxed essentially. But yeah, I mean, and one of my colleagues spoke at the press briefing there at the UN and how difficult it was for her to kind of change her shifts around. She's another ER doctor, and how hostile the environment has become. And it's the same. I mean, we can't associate our workplace with the work that we're doing in Gaza. I deliberately go out of my way to not associate my workplace with the work that I'm doing in Gaza. And I know that a lot of physicians have been fired or have basically been put on this blacklist that, do not hire or whatever it is. And it's such a hypocritical thing because we stand for humanity as healthcare workers. We are supposed to be the protectors of humanity. And it doesn't mean that it's only for a subset of people. This is across all boards. And so when we're being silenced, when these are just blatantly, violations against humanity, it's mind-boggling to me that this continues to happen. And I think collectively it's important as healthcare workers to have this voice, this unified voice, because we are more powerful that way. And we need to get out of this mindset that, I'm scared or it's too much of a risk or this and that. I think everybody is capable of saying something in their own realm to a certain extent. And I understand there's, realistic aspects to this about keeping a job and whatnot, but I think that we can all make efforts in doing it. But yeah, I think that there has been some media release for this specific report. Hopefully it'll gain the traction that we need, but
Yeah,
I think it needs to be pointed out and it definitely needs to be emphasized in the community.
yeah. What stories from, I think I asked you this the first time that you were on the podcast, but what stories, what images, what patients keep you up at night? What are you most worried about in terms of not just assessing the damage in Gaza to the healthcare system, but the enormous efforts that need to happen immediately in order to repair and rebuild the healthcare infrastructure? What are you thinking about these days?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking more about, what happens now. And I'm afraid that people are looking away now because this ceasefire has been announced. And it's like there's a running joke now, like you seize, we fire. That's kind of like how, the Israeli military sees it as we can break all these rules, but you can't. And there's been certain agreements that have, been put in place, but they're just not being, there's no compliance with it from the Israeli military. But I'm worried about if this went back to, the end of the ceasefire. I can't imagine something more cruel than that. There are people that are so happy and that they're celebrating and they're able to go back to a somewhat, normal existence because there are no bombs dropping on their houses and their tents. But if we went back, I mean, I can't imagine that. That's number one. But two, we need to empower the people of Gaza to be able to rebuild their own, population and their state because displacing them and moving them out of that land and then saying, okay, we're going to make this great again or whatever it is, and now allow them to return is probably about the most inhumane thing after they've endured 16 months of this. And they don't want to leave. They want to come back. And there's no reason why they should have to leave. That doesn't make any sense. It's just not, it doesn't make sense on any level, like ethically, but also economically doesn't make any sense. Um, we need to be able to rebuild everything that's been destroyed. So all of the aid and all of the things that I spoke about earlier, the infrastructure, the electricity grids. I mean, when you go into Gaza, you see how the roads are just completely ripped apart. The electricity grids, the water system, all of it has been completely annihilated. And so you can bring, temporary shelters back and such, but those type of things need to be rebuilt, and they need to allow the equipment needed to rebuild that. And the staff, the people, the trained professionals that they should be allowed in, and even if that means foreign aid workers being allowed in, they should be allowed in. This whole restricting these type of things is a further, like, another level of inhumanity. It's just, it needs to stop. It has to stop.
Yeah. 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 And what do you think is the most important thing that people, who are not involved in the medical relief world can do? What are some tactical, practical ways that people can get involved?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest, thing is understanding this whole excuse of there are, Hamas terrorists and things like that that they're trying to say are in the hospitals, and we all live there for extended periods of time. I was there 2 times. I lived there for 4 weeks straight, in and out of the hospital at all hours. Spoke to everybody there. Nothing was restricted for us in the hospital. We never saw military combatants. We never saw weapons. So that excuse, that narrative that we're doing it because we're trying to get at something, that's just not true. It's just not true. And the public needs to understand that, that's been the excuse, the running excuse to destroy this healthcare system. But also, you cannot bomb an idea out of a person's head, right? The idea that they want to exist, that they want to live in their state that they belong to, that they were born in. You cannot bomb that idea out of people's head as a collective population. You can't bomb people into suppression, into submission. And so that narrative of, we're trying to get rid of a certain group of people, of we're trying to get rid of Hamas, you're trying to get rid of an idea. And that's just not possible. And we've seen what happened after ceasefire. Clearly nobody was gotten rid of. And so I think that people in general need to understand that being silent in the face of evil is evil itself, right? A very famous quote by Bonhoeffer Dietrich, that we cannot continue to remain silent. We have to say, we have to speak up. And for some people, that means protest. For some people, that means doing media. For some people, that means doing, educational talks or whatever. And it may just be simply having a conversation with somebody about it, just to change the narrative. And I've seen some beautiful things come out of, like, musicians and artists, and to represent what's actually been happening in Gaza. And everybody has their part. Everybody has their role. But we just can't bury our heads in the sand anymore. So to say, is just not okay, especially in the United States, where we are directly funding this.
That's right. And just because there's a ceasefire doesn't mean that the fight is over for,
Oh gosh, no.
yeah,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
Well, Dr. Mimi Syed, thank you so much again for coming back on the Electronic Intifada podcast. Please keep us posted on Mira's condition. I think a lot of our audience would like to know that she and her mother and her family are not just surviving but thriving, and hopefully they get the care they need. So yes, please keep us posted, and we'll have you back on very soon. Thank you so much,
Will
Mimi.
do. Thank you, Nora. Bye-bye.